So, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here on this rather cold night that's going to take us into December. We are here to talk mostly about Rinky-Dink revolutionary practice, and I'm very excited to do so. By way of introduction, my name is Janeeth, or Jay, whatever's easier. I am in my last year of medical school at the University of Illinois College of Medicine, the campus in Rockford. I studied neuroscience and philosophy as an undergrad. I did an MPH at UIC, and then I did some work in Colombia helping teach English. And now I'm in medical school, and I hope to be a psychiatrist. I hope that in some ways my practice of psychiatry informs my advocacy and vice versa. That's the hope at any rate. I'll pass it off to Dr. Waitzkin.
Well, so I'm Howard Waitzkin, and I have had the privilege of being asked to advise this group now for several years, and it's my background is, from basically a precarious family and growing up in a small town in Ohio, which kind of shaped my later decisions. I think basically through good luck, got into college and medical school and spent in graduate school later, and spent most of my life working in community-based health settings of different kinds, health centers and public hospitals in the United States and also in Latin America to some extent. And I've taught at several places and have been emeritus for about 10 years, also from the University of New Mexico. So have much less committee work, which is opened up a lot of opportunities to do other things like this.
Thank you, Howard. Dr. Ayers?
Hi, my name is Bill Ayers. I'm a retired professor from the College of Education at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where I spent almost 30 years. I am an adjunct at the University of Chicago in the writing program and an adjunct at DePaul University in their education program.
Excellent. Thank you both. I meant to say for being here. David, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'm David Black. I'm a comrade of Howard's in Horizontal, which is part of the book. And Bill probably doesn't remember, but I was a comrade of his 50 years ago in Michigan.
How could I forget?
I was at Oakland University, and he was the SDS regional representative based in Ann Arbor. I then went to graduate school in Ann Arbor before I went to law school. I retired after 38 years of representing auto workers in their everyday legal needs, and now do pro bono work sealing and expunging criminal records.
Come here.
Thank you, David. Thank you for being here. Dr. Stein and Dr. Doyle, would you like to go next?
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I'm actually a physician in Chicago. I'm familiar with Howard Waitzkin a little bit in the sense that I've been involved with APHA for a number of years, but I also have been kind of a radical kind of person in a way, because as a matter of fact, that Dr. Ayers mentioned UIC. I was at UIC from 72 to 74, involved with struggles there around the war, that sort of thing. And also, I was at the event that Trump decided to not go to a few years back. So I'm a person who wants to fight racism, and I'm just curious. I heard about this through Ann Sheets, who actually is, I've worked with her somewhat in the PNHP, Physicians for National Health Program. So I thought, well, this sounds interesting. At the same time, I'm here with you guys. I'm actually trying to finish up some notes that I wrote from clinic today. So I'm paying attention though. Thanks.
You know, Simon and others who aren't on video, if it wouldn't be too much trouble to get on video, I'd appreciate it because I actually have a unilateral hearing loss and I do read lips to some extent. So it just helps me understand what you're saying if it's not too much trouble.
Well, if I don't look, I say if I'm looking down at the keyboard, that's because I am.
Thank you, Dr. Pillar. Dr. Stein and Dr. Doyle, would you like to introduce yourselves?
I'm not a doctor. I am a retired social worker, educator, having worked in community health in a community health center here in West Virginia up until recently, from the early 80s till now. And I predominantly worked with families and with pregnant women, and then later people with chronic health conditions. And I'm married to Dr. Doyle here.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Doyle. I'm a family physician here in Southern West Virginia. A connection for me is that Howard Waitzkin and I were classmates together in medical school. And so that was a big inspiration to me then and for many years. We were also roommates on an occupational health and safety tour of Cuba in 1979, which was pretty exciting for us. We came here after residency in 1978 to be part of a community health center started by the United Mine Workers of America, and have been here ever since. And I'm almost retired, but not quite.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us.
Actually, I just wanted to thank Dan for coming too. Among the reasons why I thought it would be good for Dan and possibly Andy, who also expressed interest, is that it's possible to actually, we've learned, have lifelong relationships on and off as friends, starting off by doing what seemed at the time pretty lunatic things together as students. And the admiration is more than mutual. Let me assure you, Dan, so welcome. And Linda as well.
Sorry for the clicking noises. Yeah, I think that we have an amazing cast of characters assembled tonight, and it's an honor to be able to talk to all of you. Thank you for making the time to be here. If it's all right, maybe we can get into it just real quickly though. Critical dialogues, the idea is to create a space as we go, where we aim for respectful interrogation as we make and unmake knowledge. So I'm the host, and maybe I've done some work organizing this, but I'm by no means the leader in a hierarchical sense, and I'm happy to see this conversation go how it goes. So if anyone has a way that they would like to start, I invite them to go ahead and do so.
Well, Jeanette, why don't we just continue the introductions briefly, because there are actually a couple of other new people, and it'd be good to know the other colleagues of yours at UIC as well.
Sure. So I'll go ahead and call on whoever else is here, and while you introduce yourself, if you can, please turn on your camera. Abe?
Oh, hi, sorry. Yeah, I'm Abe. I'm a fourth year medical student, like Janine. I'm planning to match internal medicine somewhere in the Midwest, probably in Illinois. And I think these discussions are important, just to kind of question like where we are right now, like with our healthcare system and everything in general, and just see what else there could be.
Thanks, Abe. Good to see you. Amy?
I'm on mute. Hi, y'all. My name's Amy Finnegan, and Mike Westerhouse here. We're calling from Minneapolis. I'm a sociologist. I teach justice and peace studies at the University of St. Thomas, which is a Catholic college here in St. Paul, and have gotten to know Howard through Equal Health Social Medicine Consortium and the Campaign Against Racism, which is where we have the mutual goal of dismantling racial capitalism.
Yeah, and hi everyone, Mike Westerhouse. I practice primary care in the Twin Cities here at a refugee and immigrant clinic, and also very involved in the social medicine consortium, and appreciated the publicity that came out in our listserv, and good to be connected with you all.
We're just attending to children, so that's partly why we're not on video. I apologize.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it. Gauri? You're muted.
Hi everyone, sorry I was muted. I'm Gauri and I am trying to match this year. I currently work at Ortho Illinois in the research department, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Ken?
Hello, everybody. I'm walking my dog right now, which is why I'm not videoing. I'm a psychiatrist. My name is Ken Thompson. I'm in Pittsburgh, and I'm a social psychiatrist, and I've been involved with leftist politics and health and medicine for. I'm a little bit short of the generation of Howard and crowd, but since the late 70s, and I'm happy to be on the call.
We're happy to have you here. Sagar.
Hi everyone, I'm Sagar, also an M4. I helped Janeed start Journal Club and have been kind of helping him throughout the process, but he does most of the work. Just wanted to especially thank some of the M4s for joining today, just because it's kind of a stressful period for us with interviews going on. So that's also why I have to bow out a little bit early today, unfortunately, just because I have some interview resident dinner I have to get to. But thanks, and glad to be a part of this.
Good to see you. Have I missed anyone? I think that's it, unless I'm mistaken. Okay. Well, should we dive into it? I think that we could start with Rinky-Dink, but there's the question of praxis that I would like at some point to arise, and maybe if we want the conversation to center in some way on what we can do and how we can unify our thought and our behavior in a struggle against the brutalities of capitalism, it might be good to start with this word, praxis, which kind of contains a lot of the history of that thought exactly. But if there's a different place that would be better to start that someone would like to propose, that's okay too. All right. So what is praxis? And why, if at all, should we aim for it in our goal to, and what seems to be a shared goal to challenge our current political economic structure?
Maybe I could just very briefly introduce this. I actually feel that the concept and practice of praxis has been very helpful for me personally, because I find myself spending actually most of my life dealing with bad effects of causes that don't get addressed. This is, day-to-day life in medicine now. And I'm sure that, and in other fields like education and social work and so forth. So I'm sure that all of you can relate in that we spend much of our time both clinically and in terms of social medicine and public health, and in terms of our political work, trying to improve things that actually are effects of more fundamental causes that we don't usually get around to addressing. And I'm speaking for myself there. So over time, I've realized more and more, although I've been familiar with it for actually since I first learned about Gramsci as part of a hospital workers' strike during my residency, which had a study group associated with it. This is a very militant strike at Stanford during my internship, actually. That it's actually very important to try to address the combination of theory and practice so that at least some clear understanding of why we're doing this in the big picture guides our day-to-day work in much of what we do, and our day-to-day life, as people in the world. So that's just a brief comment of why I thought it was important. Gramsci has been an inspirational person to me for a variety of reasons, most of which was that he accepted the risks of doing this sort of thing under very, very dangerous situations, namely Italian fascism, and was in prison for much of his life, where he actually wrote in collaboration with various other revolutionaries at the time, the prison notebooks in particular, in which he develops in the most depth the philosophy of praxis. So I guess it'd be helpful if anybody else had any comments about this in terms of especially day-to-day life.
Yeah, I think that uniting theory and practice is essential. But I find that when it comes to fighting something as large and seemingly amorphous as racial capitalism, the roads of action often diverge, and often dramatically so. I feel like, for example, you can be very informed about what's going on and how things need to change, but over the course of history, many people have chosen violence and many people have chosen nonviolence. And if, say, person A and person B are both trying to unite theory and practice, is there a moral framework that allows us to assess which praxis was a better one? Or is the moral framework of praxis contained within each person's behavior? I feel like that's a question that I have come across, or that has come across my mind, and I feel like presents a problem for that idea in my understanding of it. I don't know.
Howard does argue in Rinky-Dink with some statistics to back him up that nonviolence seems to work in more situations than violence. And that would certainly be true here, where we have, we're greatly outnumbered in terms of weaponry and skill and everything else, that we really are limited to nonviolence, and that may not be a bad thing.
Howard, you cite Erica Chenoweth's book in your Rinky-Dink book. There's a phenomenally insightful New Yorker profile of Chenoweth in the current New Yorker. I don't know if you saw it, but it's really well worth getting, partly because it popularizes. I mean, her writing is not that difficult, but this New Yorker piece really takes it quite far. And also Gene Sharp and others. I was looking for you in that article, but it didn't get that far. But the article right before it is about the Vallejo, California Police Department. And it's a profile of 10 years of absolutely staggering violence. And I was talking to my son, one of my sons, and I said, this is the best case for defunding the police, even though they never say defund the police, which has become kind of an electrifying, weaponized slogan of the Republicans. But it is an absolute case study in why the kind of amping up of a police state is what we're witnessing, and why resisting that is so important. And then it's followed by this article about Chenoweth, I recommend. You're muted, Howard. You're muted.
Bill, would you want to share just a few words about your own moral evolution in terms of Jeanette's question on this issue? I think it might be helpful in case people haven't read your own words or own words about it. I guess in that context, I just want to mention that one of the things I refer to in Rinky-Dink is Che Guevara's work in medicine as a physician on this question of the moral confrontation of violence. And he put it very similar as we put it in the Social Medicine Consortium in the campaign against racism, actually, that it's motivated by love, that's the ethical framework of violence in terms of violent revolution. I'm not arguing for that because, as Seiji Yamada actually wrote in that review of Rinky-Dink that came out in Counterpunch, the violent approach now is equivalent to what we call suicide by cop, just because of the tremendous militarization of our societies. And I just wanted to say one other thing about that. How does this relate to tax resistance, for instance? Well, you and I, if we pay taxes federally, half of our taxes go to militarism and war. And if we pay taxes locally, property taxes, let's say, half of those go to the police. So we're talking about abolition. We have to confront the issue of taxes one way or another. So I just wanted to bring that up. So maybe, I don't want to put you on the spot, Bill, but if you wanted to just.
Well, I'll say a couple of things. I mean, I'm not so much sure where to enter in terms of where Jeanette started our conversation, but I'll say a couple of things about what you raised just now, Howard. I do think, and I think Dave and Jeanette and everyone has said, that you cannot build a movement for social justice and peace and freedom if you don't build it on a moral frame, and if you don't raise the issue of freedom in a way that people can understand it. I mean, one of the things that I think has been a great weakness of the left is framing the moral argument powerfully enough. And so we end up with take even something as stupid as the mask argument. The freedom understood as individual, choice to not stop at a stop sign, to smoke cigarette. I mean, that's freedom and the way that we've understood it. So I feel like we have a huge responsibility in terms of reframing what the conversation of freedom and morality is all about. That's number one. Secondly, I find mostly the conversations about violence and nonviolence, and I'll give you a couple of contexts, to be fairly arid. I don't think that's true in Howard in your work, but I think that what you just said is so important. When we don't pay taxes, we're doing something that's anti-violence. We're against the violence. So when we talk about violence, it can't just be looking into a teacup and saying, the Antifa people are being violent, but the good protesters are being nonviolent. That's the smallest container for the conversation. The bigger container is the largest military behemoth ever built in the history of the world, right here. We're part of it. The biggest police force ever built in the world, and so on. So if you don't start there, and I think, Howard, you do start there, then I think the conversation becomes very sterile very quickly. So I think that it's critical that we point to the real violence of what's going on and who controls the means of violence. So I often think, and so one other context, just to give you an example, there's a lot of talk about prison reform. I happen to be a prison abolitionist, but prison reform. And every time you get the conversation about prison reform, for example, right now, Cuomo in New York State is considering letting out elder prisoners, but there's always an exception. You have to be nonviolent, and that your crime has to be nonviolent. And that becomes such an odd and, for me, an odd way of framing what's going on. So the federal government is going to execute 5 people before Biden takes office. One of them is a woman who's been terrorized and abused her whole life. She struck back. She's a violent felon. What does that even mean? And the state is now going to murder her. So I feel like we sometimes lose our bearings when we focus too much on, tactics and not enough on the larger moral frame. We live in a sewer of violence. It's normalized. We don't see it. We don't name it. And when you say, Howard, don't pay taxes because we should find a frame that says, don't pay the violence tax. Don't pay the tax for violence. We should frame it in a way that people can grasp it, understand it, and make sense of it the way we make sense of it, not the way the powers that be tell us. When Nixon says, it's okay that you're demonstrating, but don't be violent, I'm like, wait a minute, what? Who are you to lecture us on violence, right? I mean, that's a short rant.
I just wanted to add 2 brief things. One is giving a plug for Bill's series, Under the Tree, I think it's called, right? A series of podcasts on freedom.
It's called Under the Tree, a seminar on freedom. And because I've been a teacher my whole life, we created the thing as if it's a class sitting under a tree talking about.
The first episode is actually an interview of his adopted son, Chesa Bodine, another hero who is now elected district attorney for the county of San Francisco.
Yes, the county and the city. And he's my first guest. I don't know how I got him of all the guests in the world, but I got my own son. Anyway, you may have read about Chase. He was in the New York Times this week because it's the first time in San Francisco that he charged a police officer with murder. It's never happened. And it's a very complicated case, and he doesn't feel the least bit vindictive about it. He feels like it'll be an educational moment. It'll be a teaching moment.
So that's, very helpful on this issue of the moral framework for violence. And I want to just say my association with Under the Tree came from the Highlander Center, as you point out. my initial association was under the Bodhi tree.
Yeah, that was what it's based on. It's based on Highlander. It's based on the Freedom Schools.
Right. But I just wanted you to know my association was the Buddhist under the Bodhi tree, the spiritual approach. So the other thing I wanted to mention about praxis in this is just consent. So very closely related to praxis is Gramsci's interpretation of consent and the ways that we consent to immoral sewers, as Bill put it. And the realization there is that none of this would proceed if a substantial, and it's hard to say how much, but it's not that large, part of the populations of our societies would withdraw our consent. Because we're the reasons this continues. And taking on that responsibility so that it doesn't become the aggressive, pernicious, immoral other that's responsible for all this, but it's actually we who are responsible. So we have to change our lives, what we stand for, what we do, what we try to convince other people to at least think about doing. It's really the locus of responsibility, in my opinion, here.
This is Dan, and so I would like to respond to some of the things I've heard. First, and I greatly respect the scholarly work that the speakers so far have done in their lives, and there's some other remarkable scholars on this call who haven't spoken up yet, and I don't consider myself one of those. I'm not anti-intellectual, but I'm certainly not. I certainly, my work has not been of that type. My work has been more as a day-to-day family physician over the years, not without theory, but certainly a lot more practice than theory, but definitely guided by theory. There's two things. One, I really appreciate and am surprised by Janit and Bill and Howard, and maybe David, I'm not sure, talking about a moral framework. I really appreciate that because it has a great ring of truth for me. And without trying to do a deep dive into the semantics of that word moral, I think we have a shared meaning about what that is. The other thing is that I'm not about to stop paying taxes unless I'm ready to go to jail. But I see the truth in what Howard and Bill are saying, and if nothing else, and when you look at kind of who we are here, mostly, but not all, white middle-class North American professionals, it's important that somebody speak up and make sure to challenge our comfort. So while on one hand, I'm not ready to start paying taxes, and I'm anxious that the fourth-year medical students not do that right now either, because I'm anxious to see you get into practice and work with communities. That challenge to our comfort and that challenge to our admitting our responsibility and you could pick other words like collusion, I think is really important, and I acknowledge it.
Does
If
anyone
you read Howard's book, he would say that you're not going to go to jail for not paying your taxes. So what is likely to happen is they'll find some way to grab the money. And you may have some penalties and interest, but Howard's sitting there not in jail and has not paid his taxes for how many years, Howard?
Well, at least since the Vietnam War, the most of that is explicit tax resistance, where I tell the IRS, look, this is what I've earned. This is what you think I owe. This is what I'm going to pay. And there's nothing illegal about that. I've never been even close to charged for any crime in relation to my tax resistance. And there's a whole network based in Milwaukee, the National War Crimes Coordinating Committee, the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, which has, 10 or 15,000 participants, none of which have ever been charged for a crime. So this is feasible in everybody's lives. It's pretty rinky-dink, it's not real exciting. You don't have to go to jail. And if the projections were instead of 10,000, if it were even just 1 million, less than the 7 million I've talked about as core revolutionaries, that would gum up the works of the system so badly that it would really make a difference, because the IRS is totally understaffed currently, not able to even symbolically pursue, tax collections. I just wanted to say, there was an interim period in which I didn't say I was resisting taxes. I was advised by my progressive accountant to do it the way Donald Trump and the other billionaires do it, just by loopholes, right? And I actually resisted more taxes that way than officially labeling myself as a tax resistor, turns out. So, we say death and taxes, the two inevitabilities. Don't do it as a medical student, because you'll have problems with state licensing boards. Not the case. Our fearless leaders, whom we just recently elected nationally, right, do it all the time. So anyway, I just wanted to respond to what Dad was saying. No need for fear about this. Education really is very liberating about taxes.
But of course, if it were, so one frame that we have on the table to talk about is you raised the question of praxis, and then we've raised the question of what is the moral ground that we think one can organize a movement around. But on this question of tax resistance and the example of Howard, it seems to me really important that we talk at some point, as this evolves over time, about movement building. That it's one thing to be a moral actor in your own, sphere, and we should all try to be that person. We should try to be our best selves, of course, and we should make strategic decisions about that. But the larger question for me is, how do we get to the 7 million, Howard? How do we, and that brings in another question, which is, how do we name this political moment in terms of building the kind of mass resistance, even rinky-dink resistance, that I think we all kind of are not only interested in, but edging toward. What is this political moment? And I guess my other question is, given the overlapping crises, the environment, the catastrophic capitalist climate collapse, the racial justice reckoning, the governmental crisis, the crisis of health and healthcare and COVID, these overlapping crises, is it possible that this is an illuminating political moment, that we can learn things from this that we couldn't learn without the crisis? And what are those things?
Hey, Bill, would you repeat that? You ended up with, what are those things? Would you wind that back about 4 sentences so I know what things refers to?
Sure. Well, I was talking about the overlapping crises that we find ourselves in. And if I were to name this political moment, I would name it as a moment where certain crises have come together. And the question that I'm raising is the COVID crisis, everybody in the mainstream is talking about getting back to normal. in my world of schools, getting back to normal is an apartheid school system that fails massive numbers of kids. I don't want to go back to normal. So my question is, in what ways is this political moment particularly illuminating, and what are the illuminations that we can look to? I could tell you a lot about education. I think many of you can tell us what's getting illuminated around health. For example, it's obvious to me, not a health person, that we don't have a healthcare system. We have a jerry-rigged, predatory, crazy. If you're privileged, you get something, and if you're not, you get nothing. So that's what I'm asking, Dan. What is illuminated, and how can we take the moment of illumination to make it a teaching moment?
What is illuminated? At this.
Do you want to mute?
I guess I just wanted to contextualize that this moment is a moment affecting the whole world. And one of the just very illuminating experiences that I keep having day in and day out is that young people all over the world are fed up. They see it. They see no future other than precarious work in an unjust system. And literally millions of people are now mobilizing in various ways in places where you would never dream this would be happening. One of the reasons why I'm so grateful to, for instance, Amy and Mike in terms of their organizational role in the Social Medicine Consortium and the campaign against racism is that this now involves thousands of social medicine activists, mostly young, all over the world, including in Africa and Latin America and so forth, who regularly communicate and work on very specific, concrete actions to move us ahead. And it's really due to their asking these questions a couple of years ago and beginning the process you're mentioning, Bill, about how does this, relate to organizing, that this is happening. And I could give many other examples of this too. So it's actually, this moment to me is a very dangerous and depressing moment in some ways, but a very, very inspiring and optimistic moment. Different from any I've ever encountered since I've been on the planet, as far as I remember, in terms of its potentialities for really bringing about a revolutionary transformation. If we can just get beyond consent and find ways to collaborate. Jeanette, why don't you maybe take the lead in terms of encouraging people to participate and or doing your questions, which in my opinion are like a brilliant, critical read of what I tried to produce. And some of them I think really deserve attention, like the first one.
Yeah.
What do doctors and psychiatrists have to do with consent, let's say?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Really quickly, though, I'd like to comment on a couple of things that have been raised and see if anyone else wants to do so. The first on morality, I think that the question that came to mind was, well, then, if we decide that the larger picture is what matters, do the ends justify the means? And going to referring to what Howard said about othering and how we create this dangerous predator that is totally unlike us to help justify our actions or indifference. If we decide upon a violent course of action, don't we have to other the whoever it is that we are directing that violence towards? And in that way, doesn't that create some kind of contradiction in our insistence upon we-ness and togetherness? And then going to referring to something that Dr. Doyle said about tax resistance and being a medical student, I believe you, Howard, that I could probably resist as a resident, but I don't know if it's because I'm brown, because my parents, when they moved here, their first jobs were in factories, and my dad worked at a Taco Bell. The bank almost foreclosed upon our house at some point. But I feel afraid. I feel afraid that, and maybe more afraid than other people, that if I resisted, I'd be more likely to get in trouble. Or if I told, if I was a part of a health system and I made it apparent to my colleagues that I was resisting my taxes, I might get hated upon more than someone who's not of my origins. Yeah, I just kind of wanted to mention those things. And if no one else has anything to say, we can go on and discuss some of the questions that I proposed in the handout.
Well, let me just say from my own experience, fear is something that does need to be dealt with. And, you know, as a budding psychiatrist, this is something that anyone interested in the psychiatric aspects of medical care has to be aware of fear and where it comes from. You know, and where it comes from is basically we're taught, something we were taught to do often by our early life experiences. Believe me, I share those early life sources of fear because that's where I came from. Over and over again, my parents getting tossed out of one apartment after another because they couldn't pay their rent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And somehow I had the, you know, good luck of realizing at some point, mainly by talking about fear in relation to comrades. I was very close to, one of them was Dan, actually, where does fear come from? It's largely an imaginary construct that we learn in school and in our interactions with doctors and psychiatrists and other, you know, opinion leaders for us. We're taught fear, and it doesn't have to really be that way. If it's done, you know, you can't really do it only as an individual, which I think is a mistake a lot of us make. We conceptualize ourselves. I mean, you know, I wasn't white for the first part of my life either. You know, white is just totally socially constructed. And, you know, I was beaten up for being non-white over and over again. So, but there are ways to deal with fear. And that's one of the very important things that we really have to try to construct for ourselves. Mutual aid, partly to overcome unnecessary fear. And it's not to say that it's not appropriate to be careful and to be wary of these things, but not to the extent that it paralyzes us.
But again, social movements, you know, fear, it's contextual. So yes, some of it is learned and some of it is overblown and so on. But what social movements have the capacity to do is to move us beyond our fear because we have each other. There's a reason that every civil rights demonstration that I ever went on began with people in a church singing. Always. What were we doing by doing that? We were facing our fear. We weren't saying we're unafraid. We weren't saying we're brave, you know, warriors. We weren't. We were ordinary people. But we were dealing with our fear because we had, number one, a moral vision, and number two, a collective that we could work with. That mattered.
Yeah, speaking to those points and the idea of mutual aid and solidarity, I feel that part of the work of building such a community is convincing people that cooperation works just as well, if not better, than competition. But going to Dr. Ayers' question on what has this tumult of our time illuminated, in part for me, it's illuminated is the incapacity of reason to get across, to work. I mean, the abundance of conspiracy theories and the inability of science to penetrate into public consciousness to convince people to act in a way that's going to save people's lives has in a lot of ways not worked. And people are gathering information from a bunch of different places and constructing their own realities to some extent. And I guess that makes me afraid that, I guess maybe not afraid is not the best word, but that makes me doubtful that we're going to be able to convince people that we can rely on each other, that we don't need to just have good faith or a belief in some kind of human goodness, but rather the science and what we can gather from social experience and history tells us that we can work together in a way that respects our individual humanities and dignities and doesn't prey upon the earth and the vulnerable. But the way people are acting and the way that they justify their behavior with the knowledge that they hold so dear, it's a little concerning that we're going to be able to do that.
Well, I want to answer back to that because I want to encourage you not to despair, because despair, like cynicism, is a weapon of the strong. They count on us being demoralized. They insist on it. So the only thing I would urge you to do, Jeanette, is take the longer view. So a lot of us in this circle are older, but you don't have to be that much older to remember a time in America when people massively thought that to be gay or to be queer was to be some kind of a monstrous animal. And who could have dreamt even 10 years ago? You remember when Obama ran for president the first time? And he was asked about gay marriage and he said, as a Christian, I can't support it. It took big mouth Joe Biden 3 years later to say he supported it. Then Arnie Duncan supported it. I was speaking to a group of teachers. I said, Arnie Duncan hates teachers, but he's okay with gay people. Let's all become gay and then he'll like us too. I mean, it's crazy, but the point is things change. And a person who you thought was the most diehard, crazy, backward, homophobic nut changed because people change. And if we didn't believe that, we couldn't be in the movement. I mean, it would be impossible. So I've seen it so many times, and it always comes from movements, from fire from below, not from great ideas from the top, but from the grinding at the bottom and the organizing at the bottom.
I want to echo that. And you've been hearing Howard and Bill use the word comrade, and that's not something that's in my daily lexicon. But in this context, it has a really important meaning because they're talking about who you can rely on. And look around, and you have who you rely on is your comrades. And you, it seems to me that you're actually pretty good at finding them and good at rallying them. So that's where the hope is, that there are comrades. And yeah, there's lots and lots. I mean, I know where you live, you only have to drive 15 minutes out in the country in any direction and find the landscape littered with Trump flags. But I just echo that. And it's easier for me to know that I don't have to be in despair than it is to know I don't have to be afraid.
It goes back to Gromsky. You remember the wonderful dialectic, a pessimist of the head and an optimist of the heart. That's the balance we have to have. And I've always argued that both pessimism and optimism are twins in the sense that they both are deterministic. They know what's coming. My mother knew that everything would be all right. My cousin believes the world's going to hell faster than, but I get strength from the fact that I have no idea what's coming. And because I have no idea, I get up every morning and I nourish the possibility, my own hope. I work with it. I want to believe it. And it's worth remembering also that the day before any revolution, it was impossible. And the day after, it was inevitable. Before Rosa Parks sat in, that was never going to change. They tried to change it. There were activists working for decades, never going to change. The day after Rosa Parks sat in, of course, It was inevitable. So I think you want to keep that kind of dialectic in mind as you go about your work.
So let me just very briefly, Dan, when you have trouble with the word comrade, what I realized from working in Latin American communities a fair amount is that the Spanish equivalent of that used in many parts of the world has a totally different connotation, namely compañero, compañera, right? I mean, do you have trouble using that?
No, siempre hablo de mis compañeros en Nicaragua. Y
Exactamente.
compañeras, y compañeres.
Exactamente. So where does that come from? And when I've thought about that, the conclusion that I've come up with is anti-communism, a horrendous part of the U.S. history. You know, basically 2 decades of Black history, Black in the sense of overwhelmingly despairing experience. It's probably, we should drop that adjective now. But that's what I always think of the Cold War in terms of darkness, you know. And we were taught that the word comrade actually has the meaning that you mentioned. So we're uncomfortable using it, even though it's a source of great, you know, hope and support. And as Bill said, the other thing I want to just mention is about science. So, Janet, you know, you mentioned that the masses out there are rejecting science. And I think that we have to be careful about thinking that that is misguided, because, you know, science has pretty badly failed in this, or at least what's called science. And, you know, out of the study group that I mentioned, the Union, we also read Habermas' his great essay, Science as Ideology. Science is ideology, for the most part. It's not reality. Reality gets deconstructed even within science. And if we look at the public health recommendations that are portrayed as scientific, like lockdowns and so forth, not scientific. So, you know, where people are coming from with anti-scientistic positions out there in, you know, what we think as redneck communities, it's actually based on a fair amount of realism about the role of science and the inconsistencies of science and the unscientific basis of what are portrayed as science. And one thing I would just suggest is get away from the hierarchical aspects of that. Whenever you're ready to say doctor, just get rid of that. Unless somebody asks you to say, call me doctor. Yes, that would just be nice, because it comes out here, you know. No one in this group wants to be called doctor particularly. So why not just start with an equalitarian approach with that? So that's just a small, but I think important comment about how we reenact these hierarchies of oppression in what we're taught to say to people. And I bring this up with patients regularly. Do you want to call me doctor? In which case, do I call you Ms. Smith? So stop there.
Yeah, Howard, I had a professor at the University of Michigan in graduate school when I was there who called all the students doctors, even though none of them were. Keep things even. So it's went the other direction.
In Brazil, in general, the professors are called Professor Howard, let's say, not by their last name, if they're called professors at all. So terms that we use in our day-to-day speech are very meaningful in terms of how these patterns get communicated.
You might have called them comrade, Howard. Just call each of them comrade.
See if you can make them uncomfortable. We've moved in a lot of different directions, but I wanted to say one thing about the moral aspect of this, which is people are concerned about. I actually found a quote from Fugitive Days, Bill, and you may or may not remember including this. It says, "How well you live your life so it doesn't make a mockery of your values." That's the question. That's the question you ask yourself.
For those of you who don't know, Fugitive Days is the first memoir that I wrote. And that frames the book. And honestly, David, that question, which was asked of me when I was 20 years old by a 24-year-old leader of Students for a Democratic Society. He asked a whole auditorium of us, full of us, how will you live your life so that it doesn't make a mockery of your values? And that question has animated almost everything I've thought about ever since, because it assumes that you have values or you can access values, and then you can commit to living in a way that doesn't undermine them. And you will fail every day. And you could either say, well, that was foolish, or you could say, let me try again to do it better. And I'm in this all the time with teachers. You know, I say to my students, how will you live your teaching life so that it doesn't make a mockery of your teaching values? And you might say something like, I will treat each student as a three-dimensional human being. And I have that on my mirror. I've got that. That's my value. That's my morality. And then you go to school and you line the kids up for bathroom at 10 a.m. And you say, oh my God, I'm treating them like objects. So you could either say the value was stupid, or you could say, I'm going to recommit and find other ways. And I think that's an important, for me, it's been an important guide. Failing all the time, you know, not living up to it, but aspiring to live up to it.
Yeah, I love that. I am an idealist myself, and I fail quite regularly, including at maintaining an egalitarian space with my ingrained practices of showing respect, lest I get an undesirable grade on some rotation. Kind of going back to what both you, Howard, and Bill have said about how people come to their conclusions. Bill, you said that all the protests that you've been a part of related to civil rights are in churches. And Howard, you talked about how there is a very rightful and deserved mistrust of science and the hegemony that science often is represented as. And I guess, well, one thing I wonder is, and kind of also tying that to our discussion on moral frameworks, are we going to trust that the moral decisions that arise out of a community don't need to be checked by anything outside of that community? And I think that there's good examples in history where I mean, medicine prior to the tyranny of corporate care was largely kind of doing its own thing, and it was an exploitative business. And then it just got transferred into the hands of a more organized exploitative business. And I guess I wonder, you know, and there's examples of small communities who feel very close knit, but then they do terrible things, or they have come to a terrible conclusion. And I guess I just wanted to raise that question of.
I think that's a hugely important question. In fact, I've been in the situation where I've been with people who think they're building a beloved community. That's their goal, that's their aspiration. And not only can it do terrible things, but it becomes not just ingrown and dogmatic, but violent toward others. And that, so yes, does it need, your question, does it need to be checked? Yes, it needs to be checked. It needs to be checked by each of us, and it needs to be checked by the world. It needs to be, so my recipe, or I think that there's a simple rhythm to being an engaged citizen, or being an activist, or being a moral person. The rhythm is simple to say, excruciatingly difficult to carry out, but it involves opening your eyes. You have to look at the world, not once, and have it all figured out, but you have to continue to open your eyes. You have to be astonished, both at the unnecessary suffering that we visit upon one another, but also at the beauty and the ecstasy everywhere. You then have to act. And the fourth thing you have to do is doubt. Howard asked me in the beginning, to maybe go a little autobiographical about my own evolution. I would say the worst excesses of the Weather Underground were committed in the first several months. And they were that we opened our eyes, we paid attention, we were astonished, we acted, and we forgot to doubt. And if you forget to doubt, then you're on the road to dogma, orthodoxy, shrill rejection of anything that doesn't fit your frame. We see it everywhere. We see it. So I often ask communities, beloved communities, to do a writing exercise together. And the exercise is to reflect for a minute on what the difference is between a community and a cult.
That reminds me, speaking on reflection, so this is a little bit of a jump, but it's back to something mentioned earlier. The questions that accompanied the announcement of Rinky-Dink Revolution, I found extremely stimulating, and I thought Howard had written those questions, but I think I heard a reference to Janit having written those questions. They're great questions, and I intend to share them with people here, because talk about what Bill just said at whatever that first thing was, questioning the world. Is that what it is? Number one that you said?
Well, my number one is open your eyes and pay attention, not once, but every day anew.
Yeah, and those questions are very penetrating. And Linda and I have looked at them together, and as I said, I intend to use them as discussion starters with other people. You don't need to read the book for those questions to be important. Some of them are a little steeped in economic theory that is beyond some of us, but they are pretty self-explanatory. So thank you for those, Janit.
I want to also reiterate my thanks to Janit. It's such an honor to feel that I could write something to be read with the depth of critical attentiveness that you've actually read this, Janit. And I would appreciate your trying to publish something about this that could actually get out somewhere, truly, because these you've actually raised a series of very fundamental issues that are the practical issues and ethical issues that need to be addressed in this type of work. And let me just tie this to who we are as scientists, intellectuals, that part of our lives that have to do with theory and the melding of theory and praxis. So, in Rinky-Dink, I refer to the phrase that was said by Frederick Jameson and probably others before him. It's easier to imagine the end of the world and the end of our economic system. Now, you'd think that a lot of smart people out there with values corresponding to what we've said would have made some progress on figuring this out. And they have. There've actually been a lot of progress about this. But that's one perception, that's one feature of day-to-day consciousness, to get back to Bill's efforts, be attentive. How what we are doing in our day-to-day work relates to changing our global political economic system that is at the root of so many of our fundamental problems in basically any arena that we want to look at. So this came up in my mind just because of the question you asked me. What are the checks on local community or communal decision making? So this is actually the revolutionary project of István Metzeros and István Metzeros' work as it's been embodied in the Nicaraguan Revolution, for better or worse. exactly this theme. How do you move beyond the capitalist state in terms of governance, so that most governance happens at the communal level, but that there are restraints and critical appraisals to prevent the kinds of excesses that you're dealing with. I can speak with some intimacy from the context of Cuba that the way democracy happens in Cuba involves this combination of really intense local community determination in terms of organizing and ethical enactment of municipal democracy with a regional and national set of balances that get put into effect. It isn't perfect, but actually when you experience the intensity of municipal elections, for instance, for Poder Popular in Cuba, it's a trip because it's not like anything you've seen before. It's so intense. So anyway, these are just some responses to what seems to be overwhelming questions. How do you actually do this? Actually, there are many, many, many people and groups that have been trying to figure out the answers to that with some success. And we don't have to start from zero.
Yeah,
I just also mention, I put on the chat some brief references that are recent to the questions of how psychiatrists and doctors take part in this consent process, which was the first question that you asked. And the work of Jonathan Metzl, whom I disagree to a great degree, but he's a very eminent, psychiatrist and primary care practitioner, who's written, several major books. The most recent is Dying for Whiteness. And the previous one is the psychopathology of protest, which is how Black protesters got labeled as having schizophrenia by psychiatry. And then to some of my work in primary care, because this has been as it is, I think, with Dan, an abiding question of how do you actually do primary care with this in mind, of not just reinforcing people's acquiescence to the system as they come in with depression, alcoholism, drug abuse, and the overwhelming experience of racism, let's say. How does that conversation happen? And the way it actually happens is we're totally unprepared for it most of the time. And then the last is an article that a comrade in Britain just wrote me about 2 days ago that actually flowed from some of that earlier work. It was in the British Medical Journal, BMJ, just this week on this topic of conversations about social determinants and how this can happen in medicine. I don't think they go far enough, but these are some of the ways that people have tried to confront this issue of how this actually happens. There's work that goes back to Foucault and others about how medicine and psychiatry work as agents of social control in bringing about acquiescence. But these are some of the more recent empirical studies of how this happens, which I think is very important for people in the healing professions in general, social work and other areas, to be thinking about and trying to confront in day-to-day experience and practice. We actually talked about this to some extent also in terms of Frantz Fanon's work in a previous session on how to bring the revolutionary perspective to clinical psychiatric encounters.
I would like to tag on to that. There's two things where, just as a a working family physician over the years, some of the insights that Howard and others have been talking about came up for me. And one of them is a book that Howard and our friends were just discussing last week by a British psychiatrist named Michael Balint. And one of the things that constantly, that was operating almost every minute of every day when I was working as a physician was the notion that diagnosis is negotiated between patient and physician. And Balint's chapter, I think, is called "The Patient's Offers, the Doctor's Responses." And that idea that diagnosis is a kind of a transaction between the doctor and the patient instead of something that the doctor dictates to the patient seems very relevant to me, and I'll put it in the chat. The other thing is, one of the first things that happened to me when I came to West Virginia, and when we came to West Virginia in 1978, was we were working a lot with people with black lung, and I was given a book by a feminist sociologist named Barbara Smith, and the name of the book was "Digging Our Own Graves." And we know Barbara Smith. She's here and continues to work. And that was the first time I was ever exposed to the notion that science is socially constructed, or even that anything is socially constructed. And the way she put that across was that science is contextual. In other words, what questions are asked depends on the, however you guys would describe it, the sort of the political, economic, or moral or immoral position from which the questions are coming. And one of the reasons it took so long for diseases like asbestosis and coworkers pneumoconiosis to be recognized in the United States was the collusion of the medical specialties with the corporations to suppress that these diseases even existed. And one of the reasons that we talk about black lung was created by the people who had it. The concept of black lung came from the families and the people who had it, not from the scientific community. And even today, when I write in the medical record, I'm always trying to decide whether to write black lung parenthesis, occupational pneumoconiosis, close parenthesis, or coworkers pneumoconiosis parenthesis, black lung disease. And black lung disease always comes with capitals, and coworkers pneumoconiosis always comes lowercase. But that's how in day-to-day life for me here, the point of science not being preeminent and being contextual and socially constructed, for my praxis here, that was really important and continues to be important.
It's a fantastic example. And of course, you can, Jeanette, you can read the DSM, any version, and watch the politics of the construction of illness right in real time. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Howard, for sharing those resources and giving them some context as well. I like to try to honor people's time. I know 90 minutes on its own, it's kind of a long time, so I'd like to try to end by 90. I think that this has been engaging and wonderful and insightful, and I've learned a lot. Really quickly, I just wanted to say that one of the things I struggle with, and this kind of ties to what has been said about community versus cult and creative constructions and destruction. I feel like there's a point in one's life when one acknowledges, okay, these are the kinds of things that I need to do to live in a way that doesn't mock my values and try to move the world towards a place that's better for everyone. But then there's this part of me that's like, I want to get mine first though. I want to get through medical school. I want to get through residency. I want to make sure I have a home that I can provide for my family. And then, okay, now I'm going to try to start to do some stuff to assist in the revolution. And I feel like no matter where, no matter who you talk to, they're going to be at some point in this trajectory of trying to assure their own livelihood and success, because this is an age of precarity and survival and struggle. versus balancing how much are you going to give up and sacrifice for other people. And I think that one of the key takeaways from Rinky-Dink is that it's not so much of a dichotomy that you can do what you need to do for yourself and move the world towards a post-capitalist state without so much sacrifice. But I think that sometimes going to medical school and taking massive loans and supporting the medical, biological, pharmaceutical complex, whatever, by getting an MD, part of me feels like what I do is going to be a formality to some extent. It's a symbolic, empty formality because I'm going to medical school and my loans are owned by the government. I'm going to be paying them off for a long time, and I'm going to be working as a wage slave, maybe, if that's how you want to put it, to pay those off. And so I think that message from Rinky-Dink is an important one. I just kind of wanted to say that, and that it's available at Daraja Press, which is an amazing publisher. But if anyone else wants to have the last word,
I would like to just say one thing to what you just said, which is that every human being, every one of us, everyone who's ever been in a movement has to balance that me and we. That's the tension. But every contradiction you point to, and we live in contradictions. So let's not pretend that we can live beyond contradictions or that we can solve some of these things that you raise. But let's instead say we're going to live within those contradictions. We're going to find ways to reach out and build comrades, Dan, to build a community where we can take these things on. So I want to quibble with you. I don't think you're going to be paying off student debts for the next 100 years, because I think we're going to have a rinky-dink revolution against student debt. And I think it's coming. I think it's if you go back even 5 years and you would tell me we're going to be discussing in the pages of CBS or the page of the New York Times and on CBS, things like reparations, which I've been talking about for 60 years. I never thought we'd be talking about reparations in the New York Times. I didn't think we'd be talking about defund the police and cancel the debt. You remember, Howard, when Castro said to the Tricontinental, cancel the debt. That's what the third world should do, cancel the debt. I never thought this would be discussed in proper company, but it is being discussed. Jeanette, I plan to be on the barricades with you, demanding that they cancel the damn debt, and we should.
Yeah, and I think there's somewhat of a middle ground. You don't have to, you don't have to live amongst life to do good work. And Bill was an example of that when he turned into a professor from whatever he used to be. But I represented auto workers for 38 years. It was a great honor. When I began, I was earning less than the people I represented. And I thought that was fine because they worked harder. They had a harder job than I could sit at a desk. They had to be out in that damn factory in the heat and everything else. And I had 4 children, and they would sometimes say, well, if you would get a real job, at a big law firm, we could have more stuff. And I would have to say, that's not my goal in life. So I never missed a paycheck. I never starved, but I didn't get rich, and that was not my goal.
I
haven't spoken, but I've been listening. And I just wanted to address the issue of what happens after residency, because I'm a physician that is dealing with this all the time. I'm a primary care. I'm actually med peds. I see adults and kids, mostly adults, and I'm working my butt off. And the tendency is for the system to grind you down so that you don't have time to do anything but just do patient care, and that's it. You don't have time to even think hardly after that, and even if you're thinking when you're seeing patients. So I think that, as I say to some of my friends, you can pat yourself on the back and say, oh, you're being a good doctor, but it's really not being a good doctor if you don't change society. So, I think that's one issue. And not to mention the fact, I hope there's something big change happens before you finish your residency, because psychiatry is one of the least populated professions. They need more psychiatrists, almost any other profession in medicine. And so they need you badly as a psychiatrist, not necessarily as a changer of society. So it's going to be a tricky proposition, but I wish you luck in that. Thanks.
And just briefly in response to also what Janet was saying, the ideology of discounting the present for the future is also something we learn. You know, I'll do this, I just can't do it now. Bad news. I can tell you from my own experience, each time I've gotten into that trap, I've regretted it. And each time I've resisted getting into that trap by being honest about, you know, my values and what I'm trying to accomplish here on the planet. I've been glad I did, even if it led to some problems. They were never life-threatening problems, but definitely worth taking the small risk involved. So about being, you know, a wage slave, Jeanette, you better believe that you're going to be a wage slave paying off this huge debt. And the answer to that is don't pay it. As several other people have said. What a terrific organizing strategy while you're a resident to get 1,000 other residents to just say, no, we're not going to do that.
That's it. Allies, comrades, a movement.
And that, you know, I mean, are there millions of people in and outside of the health professions affected by debt? I mean, as David Graeber wrote, debt its first 5,000 years. You know, it's like debt is a huge issue. It's part of capitalism through and through. It's our parasitic financial relationships that accomplish nothing. These financial institutions that only rip us off. You know, they actually would never even have the money to pay off our deposits if we asked for them, because they create loans out of making up money and particularly. So anyway,
that's a great idea. That's a
yeah, but you know, when you're having this insight, oh, that's a problem. There's no reason you have to accept that.
Well, there's two things. I'd like to say two quick things, Howard. One, and this is really for Janine. One is that we experience our problems as personal. And if we look more deeply, they're social. So, you know, taking care of my elderly parents, it was my hell to bear, but it was a social problem. Taking care of little kids, it's a social problem. Health is a social problem, and so on. So try to find the social and find the allies and the community. But the other thing, and this is an analogy, but I think it's relevant to your situation. My little brother, retired as a legendary high school English teacher in Berkeley, California. And he used to say to me, an education professor, he'd say to me, I've come to terms with the fact that I am 60% an agent of the state and 40% a free agent. But man, I use that 40% to the max. Nobody screws around with me on my 40%. Other times I give the goddamn tests, I take attendance, blah, blah, blah. But that's important that he found a way to say, I get up every morning, ready to go. I end every evening criticizing myself for not doing enough. And that dialectic, forgiveness, critique, keeps you going.
I want to say to Janet and Gowrie and Abe, who left, I really love this idea that Howard's putting out there about don't pay it. And my suggestion would be tie that to, and one idea for your movement would be unilaterally declare that you're doing social service instead. You know, which is an institution that goes on all over the world. And so I think that has a lot of potential. You know, that's what David Black did as a young attorney. So I'm excited by that possibility. Let us know how we can help.
And this applies to each area of resistance that we've talked about. tax resistance is the same thing. We
Yeah.
tax resistors don't just not pay tax the way Trump and the other billionaires don't. We actually create alternative funds that go into local communities that, I describe one way to do this in Rinky-Dink, but there are many other ways. This is how we build the post-capitalist solidarity economy, by making decisions like this. Very low risk, they're collective decisions, and you generate big bucks actually with a relatively small number of people who decide to take these kinds of actions. Like, not paying your debt. So it doesn't mean it just goes into our Mercedes, right?
Mhm.
Fund for whatever we feel that is consistent with constructing a post-capitalist, humane, survivable planet.
I just want to uplift one comment I made in my review of Rinky-Dink, which was, I talk about Howard guiding us into the future. And then I say this, but the future for him and the future we behold is not some imagined socialist utopia following a violent insurrection somewhere vaguely on the farthest horizon. Rather, the future is a tangible, practical way of living here and now, a beloved community in the making, always opposed by the powerful, but within our collective reach if we'll reach out for it.
Well, I think I can speak for all of us when I say that this was awesome, and it's been fascinating, and I know that I'm going to take a lot of what I've heard and felt today with me forward, and I thank you all for being a part of it.
Thank you, Ginny, for organizing it. Thank you very much, Howard.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
So if you haven't read it, read Howard's Rinky-Dink Revolution, and buy a pitchfork and settle down on your couch and read it.
Nice meeting you people.
Yeah, nice
Great
meeting you.
to see you. Great to hear from you. Linda, Dan, thank you.
And I wish everyone well. Stay safe and have a happy holiday.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Gori.